The old truck was the only thing Mason Reed had left of his late wife. Then, in broad daylight, Connor Blake, the arrogant rich neighbor, sent his men to smash it apart, hoping to force the widowed father off the land he wanted to seize. The whole town expected Mason to fold. No one knew the quiet mechanic had once led a Navy SEAL team through missions where lives hung on every decision. When Connor kept pushing, Mason did not explode in anger. He struck back with precision and made sure Connor paid a price he never saw coming. If you believe true patience is never weakness, stay with this story and watch the quiet reversal unfold completely. The morning began quietly in the small town of Mill Creek, Virginia, the kind of place where everyone knew the sound of everyone else's engine before they saw the car. Mason Reed unlocked the front bay of his repair shop just after 7, the metal door groaning up on its tracks the same way it had every day for 6 years. He drove a dark blue Ford pickup that had seen better decades, dented along one flank, the paint faded from long afternoons in the Virginia sun, worth almost nothing to anyone who did not know its history. His late wife had bought that truck before Luke was born, and together they had used it to haul lumber and paint cans and secondhand furniture while building the life they imagined for their family. Luke, now 9 years old, ran out with a lunchbox clutched to his chest, handed it to his father with a hurried hug, and sprinted for the yellow bus idling at the corner. Watching the boy go, Mason allowed himself a small private smile, the kind he rarely showed anyone else, then turned back toward the shop where a woman in a tailored gray coat was already waiting beside a rental SUV that ticked and hummed unhappily under its hood. Her name was Charlotte Hayes, and she introduced herself with the brisk efficiency of someone used to being taken seriously in rooms full of men who assumed otherwise. She was in Mill Creek to review a development called Silver Ridge, a resort project her company, Hayes Development, was partnering on with a local businessman. Mason listened to the engine for a moment, popped the hood, and found a loose belt that had been squealing since somewhere outside Richmond. He tightened it in under 10 minutes and told her there was no charge, since the job had taken less time than writing up the invoice would have. Charlotte studied him for a beat longer than the moment required, surprised by a mechanic who did not try to invent problems for a stranger's rental car, and something about his steadiness stayed with her as she thanked him and turned to leave. Before she could pull away, a low white sports car rolled into the lot, and the man who stepped out of it moved like someone who had never once doubted his welcome anywhere he went. Connor Blake wore his confidence the way other men wore expensive watches, visibly and without apology. He glanced at the shop with open contempt, told Mason his little operation was an eyesore next to what was coming to Mill Creek, and said the access road for his resort would need to run straight through the parcel behind Mason's house. He offered to make it simple, framing the demand as a favor, and suggested Mason would be smart to sell before things became complicated. Mason wiped his hands on a rag, met Connor's eyes without heat, and told him plainly that the land was not for sale, not now and not later. Connor's smile thinned at the edges, and he said the road was going through with or without Mason's blessing, before climbing back into his car and pulling away in a spray of gravel. Charlotte stood watching the exchange, sensing a tension she did not yet understand, and drove off with the uneasy feeling that the story behind that land was far from finished. 2 days later, a lawyer in an expensive suit arrived at the shop carrying a folder and an offer roughly 30% above market value for Mason's property. Mason declined again because the land held meaning no number could replace, the quiet acre where he and his wife had once sketched plans for a garden and a small workshop where the family could build things together. Within a week, the pressure shifted from polite to punishing, arriving in small, deniable increments that Mason recognized immediately as the work of someone with money and patience. Parts suppliers who had shipped to him for years suddenly cited delays. Longtime customers began canceling appointments without explanation. A county inspector showed up with a clipboard full of vague violations that had never mattered before, and the bank that held his small business loans sent a letter announcing a routine review that felt anything but routine. Mason understood exactly what was happening, that Connor intended to strangle his livelihood quietly enough that no single act could ever be proven in court. Charlotte, meanwhile, sat through a planning meeting where Connor presented the proposed access road as a formality, telling the room that the landowner behind the shop was, in his words, practically ready to sign. She had no reason to doubt him until she stopped by the shop afterward to thank Mason for the earlier repair, mentioned the road, and watched his expression go still. He told her, simply, that he had never agreed to anything, and that no one from Connor's office had even properly asked. Charlotte felt the first cold thread of suspicion toward her business partner, though she kept her doubts to herself for the moment, unwilling to accuse a man on the word of a mechanic she barely knew. Connor spotted the two of them, talking through the shop window, and marched in uninvited, mocking Mason in front of Charlotte, calling him a small-town grease monkey trying to inflate the value of a worthless lot. Mason said nothing in response, which seemed to irritate Connor more than any insult could have. When Connor reached out and gripped Mason's shoulder, meaning to shove him back a step for effect, something in the room changed instantly and without violence. Mason's hand closed around Connor's wrist, turned it a few precise degrees, and guided it down and away in a motion so fast and so controlled that Connor barely understood what had happened until his arm was already free again. There was no pain, no bruise, nothing anyone watching could call an assault. Only the unmistakable sense that the man standing calmly by the workbench could have done far more if he had chosen to. Connor pulled his hand back, laughing off the moment as nothing, telling himself Mason had probably picked up a self-defense class somewhere along the way. He did not consider, even for a second, that the quiet mechanic in front of him had once commanded men through operations most people would never be cleared to hear about. Charlotte, however, noticed everything, the economy of the movement, the absence of anger in Mason's face, and filed the memory away without yet knowing what to make of it. The following week, on a gray Wednesday afternoon, Mason left the shop to deliver a repaired sedan across town, and the security camera on the hardware store across the street conveniently lost its signal for exactly the 20 minutes that followed. Connor arrived with 3 hired men staying near his car with his arms folded while the others went to work on the truck he had been trying to buy for months. They shattered the windshield first, then the side windows, then stripped the mirrors and headlights before running a small rented loader into the front end until the hood crumpled like paper. When the truck no longer resembled anything worth saving, they dragged it sideways off its parking spot and shoved it down into the drainage ditch beside the lot. Connor filmed the wreckage on his phone, already composing in his mind the message he planned to send Mason, a warning dressed up as an accident. By the time Mason returned, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered along the fence line, staring at the ruined truck with the kind of silence that follows something everyone understands but no one wants to say aloud. Connor met him there with a printed map in hand, claiming the truck had been parked over the boundary line of his project and had simply been relocated as a matter of legal necessity. The lines on the map did not match anything Mason had ever seen on his deed, and he understood immediately that the document had been altered to fit whatever story Connor needed it to tell. Connor watched him closely, waiting for the outburst that would give him grounds to call the police and have Mason arrested on the spot, but the outburst never came. Instead, Mason walked the perimeter of the wreckage, noting the tire tracks pressed into the mud, the pattern of broken glass, the angle of impact on the loader, and the gas station camera visible down the road that might have caught a portion of the scene. He found, resting on the passenger seat among the shattered glass, the small keychain his late wife had carried for years, crushed nearly flat, and for one unguarded second his composure wavered before he set it gently in his pocket. He asked Connor only one question, his voice even and unhurried, whether he was certain he wanted to be responsible for what had just happened. Connor smiled and told him no lawyer in the county would take a mechanic's case against the Blake name, then turned and walked away as though the matter were already settled. Charlotte arrived minutes later, horrified by what she found, and Connor immediately tried to spin the story before she could ask a single question, insisting Mason had staged the damage himself to extort a payout. Mason did not ask her to believe him outright. He simply asked her to look at the boundary paperwork Connor had filed with her company and to draw her own conclusions once she had seen it for herself. Charlotte studied his face for a long moment, searching for the anger she expected and finding instead a controlled, deliberate calm that unsettled her more than rage ever could have. Before leaving the ruined lot, Mason noticed a dashboard camera lying near the wreck, apparently thrown loose from a customer's car parked nearby for repairs, its casing cracked but its memory card possibly intact. It was a small thing, easy to miss in the chaos, but it was the first real thread he had to pull, and he picked it up without a word to anyone watching. That night, Mason arranged for Luke to stay with his late wife's older sister a few towns over, telling the boy only that some grown-up matters needed sorting out at home. From that point forward, Luke would appear only briefly in the story, safely removed from the danger closing in around his father. The next morning, Mason carried the damaged camera and a printed copy of the altered boundary map to the office of the Newtown sheriff, a man named Jason Cole. The way Jason greeted him, starting to say "Commander" before catching himself and correcting to Mason, told anyone paying attention that the two men shared a history longer than their years in Mill Creek. Mason asked him, quietly and directly, to keep that history out of whatever came next, since he had no interest in becoming a local legend or drawing attention that might follow his son home. The salvaged footage turned out to be frustratingly thin, catching only a blurred outline of the loader and a partial license plate, not nearly enough to charge anyone with anything. Jason explained what Mason already suspected, that Connor had spent years cultivating friendships on the town council and inside the prosecutor's office, and that any misstep now would let Connor recast Mason as the aggressor. Rather than react, Mason chose to build his case the way he had once built operational plans, methodically and without haste. He began pulling public land records to trace who had actually altered the boundary map, following the money behind Connor's sudden influence with local officials, and looking for any connection between the security company Connor used and the men who had wrecked the truck. Charlotte, working a separate angle entirely, quietly reviewed her company's internal files and discovered her own digital signature attached to a boundary approval she had never seen, let alone signed. She confronted Connor about it directly in a conference room, and he brushed it off as a clerical error made by an overeager assistant, an explanation that satisfied no one, least of all Charlotte. When she suggested pausing the project until the discrepancy was resolved, Connor warned her that any delay would cost Hayes Development millions of dollars in penalties, a threat delivered with a smile that did not reach his eyes. That evening, she drove out to the shop and found Mason sorting through paperwork by the light of a single desk lamp and offered him copies of what she had found so far. Mason thanked her but refused to accept anything that might put her own position at risk, telling her he would only take documents she had a clear legal right to share. Charlotte had expected persuasion, maybe even pressure, and instead found a man more concerned with her exposure than his own case, which only deepened her respect for him. They sat together for a while over coffee brewed on a hot plate in the back office, and she finally asked him why he had not simply hit Connor when he had every reason to. Mason told her that a man who had once seen real violence up close did not waste it on wounded pride, and that restraint to him was not the same thing as weakness. Charlotte studied him in the dim light, aware for the first time that whatever quiet history he carried, it had shaped him into someone who measured his strength rather than displayed it. She left that night with more questions than answers, but for the first time since arriving in Mill Creek, she felt certain she was standing on the right side of whatever was coming. Connor, sensing that Charlotte's loyalty was slipping and that Mason was building a case he could not simply threaten away, decided it was time to remove Mason from the equation entirely. He hired 4 men to intercept Mason at the salvage yard late one night, instructing them not to kill him, but to injure him badly enough to justify planting narcotics in his van and calling the police to finish the job. Mason sensed the ambush before it fully closed around him, noticing a car left running with no driver inside, a shifting reflection across a stack of windows, a metallic scrape from behind a shipping container, and a figure quietly moving to block the only clear exit. He gave the men a chance to walk away, warning them calmly that the lot was covered by cameras whether they believed him or not, but the warning only seemed to amuse them. When the first man lunged, Mason moved with the same economy Charlotte had glimpsed weeks earlier, only now fully unleashed, each motion measured to disable rather than destroy. He slipped the opening strike, trapped the second man's wrist mid-swing to send him crashing into his own momentum, disarmed a third who produced a knife without ever letting the blade draw blood, and dropped each attacker with short, exact movements before stepping back the instant they could no longer continue. When one man scrambled toward a gun left on the seat of a nearby truck, Mason closed the distance before he could raise it, stripped the magazine free, and pinned him to the ground with a control hold that ended the fight without a single shot fired. The entire encounter, from first contact to the last man subdued, lasted under 2 minutes, a fact Jason would later note with quiet disbelief when he reviewed the timestamp on Mason's automated alert message. Charlotte and Jason arrived within minutes of receiving that message, finding 4 men groaning on the pavement and Mason standing calmly among them, uninjured and already dialing for an ambulance for the man he had been forced to hit hardest. One of the attackers, hoping to soften whatever charges awaited him, admitted under questioning that Connor Blake had paid them to stage the attack, though he stopped short of naming the man who had handed him a small bag of narcotics to plant in Mason's van. Jason found that bag himself, still tucked in the attacker's jacket pocket, and understood in that instant that Mason had turned Connor's trap into hard evidence of a conspiracy far larger than a single act of vandalism. Charlotte, watching the scene unfold, finally asked Mason outright what exactly he had done in the military to move the way he moved, and he answered only that his job had been to bring people home, nothing more. Furious that his plan had collapsed, Connor turned to the one weapon he still trusted completely, his family's influence, and leaked a heavily edited video online that showed only the moment Mason dropped each attacker, stripped of any context showing the ambush that preceded it. He described Mason publicly as an unstable former soldier who had lost control, and a prosecutor with close ties to the Blake family opened an inquiry into possible assault charges before the full footage had even been reviewed. The town split almost overnight, some residents frightened by the rumors, while longtime customers and neighbors who actually knew Mason spoke up loudly in his defense at the diner and the hardware store. Charlotte hired an independent forensic technician to recover the complete, unedited footage from the salvage yard's security system, determined to correct the record before it could do any more damage. At the same time, a local reporter dug into military records and uncovered the outline of a career Mason had spent years keeping quiet, a command role within a Navy SEAL unit, commendations for saving both fellow service members and civilians under fire, and a quiet decision to leave the service early when his wife's illness demanded he come home. The story spread through Mill Creek within a single day, and Connor, certain the revelation would paint Mason as dangerous, watched in frustration as it did precisely the opposite, drawing veterans and ordinary residents alike firmly to Mason's side. Mason took no pleasure in the exposure, telling Jason privately that he had no interest in being excused from scrutiny simply because of what he had once done in uniform, and insisting the case be judged strictly on evidence rather than reputation. Charlotte found herself moved by that insistence, recognizing a man who had not hidden his past out of shame but out of a refusal to use it as leverage over anyone. One evening she stayed late helping him reorganize files scattered across the back office, and came across an old photograph tucked inside a folder, Mason standing beside his wife years earlier, both of them laughing at something long forgotten. She did not try to fill the space that photograph represented, only remarking gently that the woman in the picture must have understood him better than almost anyone ever could. Mason, for the first time, spoke openly about the promise he had made after her death, to raise Luke in a home built on steadiness rather than fear, a promise that had shaped every quiet choice he had made since. It was around this same time that Charlotte, cross-referencing financial disclosures late into the night, discovered a substantial payment Connor had funneled through a shell consulting firm registered to the cousin of the very prosecutor now pursuing charges against Mason. Working together, Mason, Charlotte, and Jason spent the following days assembling the fragments into a single coherent picture of exactly how far Connor's scheme extended. At its foundation sat a falsified boundary map designed to quietly annex a portion of Mason's land into the resort footprint, layered beneath a forged digital signature that made Charlotte's company appear to have approved documents she had never actually seen. On top of that sat a network of bribes intended to rush the access road's approval through the town council before anyone could object or ask the right questions. The destruction of Mason's truck, Charlotte realized, had never been simple cruelty, but a calculated attempt to cripple his ability to work, push him toward bankruptcy, and force the land sale he had already refused twice. She also understood, with a growing unease, that Hayes' development itself now carried real legal exposure if the project moved forward on documents this compromised. Calling an emergency meeting with her board, she found several members eager to settle everything quietly to protect the company's stock price, rather than risk a public scandal. Charlotte refused outright, telling the board plainly that the company would cooperate fully with any federal investigation rather than bury what they had found. Connor, learning of her decision, retaliated by pushing members of her own board to consider removing her, spreading rumors that she was romantically involved with Mason and sabotaging the project out of personal bias rather than principle. For a moment, Charlotte's career stood on the edge of collapse, a fact Mason was careful to acknowledge when he urged her not to sacrifice everything she had built on his account. She told him plainly that she was not doing this for him at all, but for the dozens of families who might become Connor's next target if no one stopped him now. In that moment, Mason understood that Charlotte was not a wealthy executive who had arrived to rescue him from his troubles, but someone willing to risk her own position for the sake of what was simply true. Jason, meanwhile, reported that a county land records clerk was prepared to testify about the falsified map, but was terrified of retaliation from the Blake family's considerable reach. Mason quietly arranged protection for the clerk without overstepping any legal boundary, keeping careful distance while ensuring nothing happened to her before she could speak. When Connor sent someone to trail her movements, Mason noticed within a day, and rather than confronting the man directly, simply led him unknowingly toward a spot where Jason's officers were already waiting. The man was arrested carrying detailed notes on the clerk's daily schedule, along with written instructions for intimidating her into silence, evidence that would prove damning in the weeks ahead. Shortly afterward, the clerk came forward and handed over the original, unaltered survey map, definitive proof that the boundary of Mason's property had never legally changed at all. With that single document, the last pillar of Connor's scheme collapsed, and the case that had once seemed impossible to prove now stood on solid ground. Jason filed for an emergency hearing before the town council, determined to bring everything into the open before Connor could manufacture another delay. The hearing was held on a humid evening in the town council chambers, the room filled far beyond its usual capacity with residents who had followed the story for weeks. Connor arrived flanked by a team of lawyers, still confident that money and connections would carry him through one more crisis the way they always had before. Mason came dressed plainly, without any hint of his military service on display, wanting to be seen that evening simply as a citizen asking for the truth to be heard. Charlotte sat near the front as CEO of Hayes Development, and when her turn came, she announced without hesitation that the company was suspending the Silver Ridge project entirely and handing every relevant file over to investigators. Connor immediately accused her of conspiring with Mason, and his lawyers played the edited video once more, hoping the doctored footage would still carry the weight it once had. Jason answered by playing the complete, unedited recording, and the room watched in silence as it showed Mason repeatedly backing away, warning his attackers aloud, and reacting only once a weapon appeared. The county clerk followed with the original survey map, and a forensic technician explained in plain terms how Charlotte's signature had been copied and inserted into documents she had never approved. One of the men from the salvage yard ambush testified that Connor had personally arranged and paid for the attack, his voice shaking as he described exactly what he had been instructed to do. Connor denied everything, insisting that every witness in the room had somehow been coerced or bribed by Mason himself, a claim that grew less believable with every word he spoke. When Mason finally rose to address the council, he did not mention his rank or his service record even once. He said only that Connor had mistaken patience for fear and money for the right to own another person's life, a line that settled over the room like a held breath. Then, unannounced, Ryan Blake walked through the chamber doors, having received the full evidence file from Charlotte earlier that week and having spent days verifying it against his own family's records. Ryan confirmed publicly that the secret payments traced directly back to his son's signature, and stated plainly that he would not spend one more dollar of the family's reputation-shielding behavior he could no longer defend. Something in Connor broke at hearing his own father say those words aloud, and he lunged across the room toward Mason in a burst of pure, unthinking rage. Mason simply turned his shoulder, caught Connor's arm mid-motion, and guided him down onto the table in front of him without landing a single blow, then held him there calmly until officers arrived to take him into custody. The entire chamber fell silent, watching a man who could clearly have done far worse choose instead to end the confrontation with the least force necessary. In that moment, the town finally understood what had made Mason so unsettling to Connor from the very beginning, not the violence he was capable of, but the discipline that kept him from ever reaching for it first. It was a lesson delivered without a single raised voice that no amount of money in Mill Creek could ever purchase. In the weeks that followed, Connor faced a long list of charges that included property destruction, conspiracy to seize land through fraud, forgery of official documents, bribery of public officials, planting narcotics with intent to frame an innocent man, witness intimidation, and financial fraud spanning years of falsified filings. The prosecutor who had rushed the initial case against Mason was suspended pending his own investigation, and 2 members of the town council resigned once their ties to Connor's bribery scheme came to light. The Silver Ridge project was formally canceled, and every prior approval connected to it was placed under full review by state regulators. Ryan Blake issued a public apology to Mason, though Mason refused to let the moment turn into a spectacle, drawing a clear line between his son's crimes and an old man who had simply failed, for too many years, to see what his son had become. When Ryan offered to buy Mason a brand new truck as a gesture of amends, Mason declined politely, unwilling to let justice be settled by a financial transaction. A court later ordered Connor to pay full restitution for every dollar of damage he had caused, along with the business losses Mason had suffered during months of engineered pressure. Charlotte kept her position as CEO once the board recognized that her decision to expose the fraud, rather than bury it, had likely spared the company from a far larger legal disaster down the road. She redirected the funds originally earmarked for Silver Ridge into a downtown revitalization program instead, one built around supporting existing local businesses rather than displacing the families who ran them. Mason used a portion of his restitution to rebuild the shop and launch a small, free vocational training program aimed at veterans struggling to find steady work after leaving the service. The original truck itself was beyond saving, but Mason kept its steering wheel, its old license plate, and the crushed keychain that had once belonged to his wife, storing them carefully rather than letting the loss erase what they represented. He never let the destruction of that truck become the destruction of the memory it carried, understanding, perhaps more clearly than anyone else in town, that some things could be broken without ever truly being lost. In the end, Connor's downfall and Mason's quiet renewal traced back to the very same lesson, that believing everything could be bought was the surest way to lose everything that actually mattered. Several weeks later, Charlotte returned to the shop with an old pickup truck she had won at auction, its body rough and its paint faded in ways that reminded her instantly of the one she had seen destroyed months before. She did not offer it to Mason as a gift, sensing correctly that he would never accept charity dressed up as kindness, and instead asked him to restore it as part of a new community outreach program her company was funding. Mason agreed, and over the following weekends the two of them worked side by side in the shop, Charlotte slowly learning the names and uses of tools she had never touched before in her life. Their conversations deepened gradually, without urgency, each one adding another quiet layer to a friendship that neither of them tried to rush towards something more definite than it needed to be. Charlotte made a point of never intruding on the space Mason still kept for his late wife's memory, and Mason, in turn, never treated Charlotte as someone sent to rescue him from his grief. He admitted to her one evening that he had spent so many years simply surviving and raising his son that he had nearly forgotten a person was allowed to want more than survival. Charlotte confessed something similar in return, telling him she had spent most of her adult life measuring her worth entirely by her title and her company's balance sheet, until the past few months had forced her to see herself differently. They discovered, almost by accident, that they had both been carrying the same kind of invisible weight for years, the weight of responsibility so constant that neither of them had noticed how little room it left for anything else. At the opening ceremony for the Veterans Training Program, Charlotte stood near Mason but stayed carefully out of the spotlight, content to let the day belong to him and the men and women the program was meant to help. Luke, home for the weekend and standing nearby, noticed that his father smiled more easily whenever Charlotte was close, though he never pushed the two of them to explain what that meant. He did not call her anything more than her name, and made no attempt to force the relationship forward, asking only, in the simple way children ask important questions, whether she wanted to stay for dinner that night. Charlotte glanced toward Mason before answering, and Mason gave the smallest nod, the quiet kind of permission two people offer each other when words feel unnecessary. 6 months later, the truck Charlotte had commissioned stood finished in the gravel lot behind the shop, freshly painted the same deep blue as the one that had been destroyed, though Mason had deliberately left a few small imperfections in the metal rather than sanding every trace of history away. He mounted the repaired keychain onto its new set of keys, a small detail no one but him fully understood the weight of, and handed the vehicle over to become the workhorse of the Veterans Outreach Program, hauling tools and lumber to families who needed repairs they could not otherwise afford. Charlotte opened a small satellite office for Hayes Development in Mill Creek itself, shifting the company's approach toward partnership with residents rather than the kind of quiet pressure Connor had once relied upon. Connor was sentenced to serve term and ordered to forfeit every asset traced back to his fraudulent dealings, a judgment Mason did not attend in person, since he had never needed to witness Connor's downfall to feel that justice had finally been served. On a quiet afternoon not long after, Mason drove the newly restored truck down a familiar back road outside town, with Charlotte beside him in the passenger seat, and Luke briefly visible in the back before being dropped off for a weekend camping trip with his aunt. Charlotte asked, almost gently, whether he still missed the old truck, and Mason admitted that he did, though he had come to understand that memory never really lived inside metal or glass or an engine, but in the way people chose to keep moving forward after everything they had lost. Charlotte reached over and placed her hand lightly over his on the seat between them, and Mason did not pull away. Connor had once believed that wrecking a single truck would be enough to break a man and clear a path toward everything he wanted. What he never understood was that the strength of a former Navy SEAL commander had never lived in anything he owned, but in the people he chose to protect, the principles he refused to abandon even under pressure, and the quiet courage it eventually took to open his heart again after everything he had already survived.